Pokemon has a purpose. Every Pokemon is someone's favorite. Every Pokemon is important to their game for some reason or another. But there's gotta be one that's the worst.
And I'm not talking about what is the weakest Pokemon in every generation. I'm not talking about the rarest Pokemon in every generation. I'm talking about if you were to handpick one Pokemon from the game and remove it completely, what would be the one that makes the most sense, that makes the least amount of impact on the story that Game Freak is trying to tell with this version? And I gotta tell ya,
Pokemon was cooking back in 1996. So how did I come across doing this? Well, first of all, as any good research goes, I made a full list of all 151 Pokemon so I can figure out a reason why each and every one of these is important to the Pokemon universe. Now, I didn't want to come at this with any level of subjectivity. Just because Growlithe is my favorite Pokemon of Generation 1 does not mean it gets preferential treatment. Just because the most popular online Pokemon quiz Sporkle tells me that Lickitung is the least remembered Pokemon doesn't mean it's the least important.
so I needed to come up with some sort of a rubric to really determine what qualifies a Pokemon as useless. And I think I've come up with two qualifiers that help determine what a Pokemon's importance is: in-game necessity and expansion of brand.
In-game necessity is kind of self-explanatory. If the Pokemon in the game is used in some sort of way to elevate or explain some sort of game mechanics, it has to stay. If it has a unique evolutionary method, if it's a fossil Pokemon that can only be obtained via one specific method, these are both things that elevate the gameplay experience. They are necessary to keep in the game. Expansion of brand is though where it gets a little bit trickier to discuss and also gets into the realm of debate a little bit, but we wouldn't get to over 1,000 Pokemon if we didn't talk about the expansion of the brand. And for Generation 1, I'm primarily talking about the anime. The Pokemon games were wildly successful, but nothing was bigger in the late 90s than the Pokemon anime, and I'd pay claim that the Pokemon featured in the anime are arguably more important than many of the Pokemon that expand mechanics in the game.
And if you don't believe me, I completely understand it, but I wanted to go to the most trustworthy source that I know to help prove my point.
Hello?
Hi.
Can you name as many Pokemon as you can think of?
Pikachu, Snorlax, Squirtle, Charmander, Bulbasaur, Raichu. I don't know, you caught me off guard.
Who's the cat?
Yeah, Mewtwo.
You're not wrong,
Charizard.
technically. Do you remember the little pink puffball?
Oh, jeez.
It's Jigglypuff. Okay, it's Jigglypuff. So what Mama Xalem says goes. Let's go ahead and remove all the Pokemon that she just mentioned here. And then, of course, we gotta remove their evolutionary forms, which means all of the starters are gone. She couldn't really remember Meowth's name, but seeing as if Meowth's the only other Pokemon that's featured in nearly every single episode of the anime, we're gonna go ahead and knock off him in Persian 2.
Get it? Because they both learned knockoff, even though knockoff wasn't invented in this. Let's just move on to the next gen.
There's a couple more we're just gonna go ahead and knock out here too. I'm gonna go ahead and throw Ekans and Coughing along with their evolutions on here as well. Much like Meowth, they're featured in almost every single episode as well, so it'd be silly to not go ahead and just knock them out and call them important as well. We're also gonna go ahead and throw Caterpie on there. If you don't know why Caterpie is important, then just pause this video right now and go watch Bye Bye Butterfree. It's free on YouTube. Go cry your eyes out for 20 minutes and get that shit out of here. I'm not gonna focus on Brock and Misty just yet because I do want to group them in when I talk about all of the gym leaders in the original games. And as far as Jesse and James goes, we're also gonna mention them a little bit more in depth later.
And for consistency's sake through each region, I'm only gonna be talking about the first game in each series, unless there's an exception. I feel this is most appropriate because if these first 3 games didn't do well, then the anime wouldn't have done well and we wouldn't have gotten Pokemon Yellow and the myriad of spin-off games. If it comes down to a tiebreaker, I might mention these, but as far as right now, we are solely focusing on the first worldwide games and the anime that accompanied it. And just by mentioning all of these, we've already knocked out 24 of the total 151 Pokemon. And I think taking a look at these are some of the most iconic Pokemon in the first generation. I think the only ones we're really missing are like Psyduck? I mean, Misty's Psyduck is the equivalent of Ash's Pikachu, because neither of these little assholes want to stay inside their Pokeballs. And also Mew, which has a little bit of history to it.
Nintendo wasn't even aware that Mew was programmed into the original game, as according to an interview with original programmer Shigeki Morimoto, Mew was created 2 weeks before the game's development was even finished. But if we take a look at this handy-dandy source I have called the Pokemon theme song, I'm sorry, what's the second Pokemon that shows up in the anime opening? I don't see Bellsprout getting their own Pokemon movie.
Now, I do want to say before I go any further, I did make a prediction of what I thought was going to be the 3 most useless Pokemon for each generation. My initial thoughts were to go with Farfetch, due to it being a single stage normal and flying type. If not for that, it was gonna be Pinsir, a single stage bug type, or Tangela, a single stage grass type. Now, did this turn out to be true? Well, let's just go ahead and hop over to the games and see. Articuno, Zapdos, Moltres. All these are singular legendaries that was sought after by everyone who played these games, so they gotta stay.
Any Pokemon that is integral to the core story also has to stay, which means the 2 unavoidable fossils have to be factored into this, and Marowak.
Yeah, it's weird to say that out of all of the Pokemon introduced in the first generation, Marowak is the only one that has any sort of story significance.
I guess we can also throw the Ghastly line in there, because you can't discover what these Pokemon are without the Sylph Scope. Even more than that, they're the only Ghost-type Pokemon in the entire region. If you're gonna introduce an entire type and you only have one Pokemon to show for it, then without a doubt that Pokemon kinda has to stay. With that being said, the Dratini line are also the only Dragon-type Pokemon, so they're gonna wind up on here by default too.
Now at this point, I feel like I need to start chopping away at the Pokedex to get some Pokemon out of here, so keep in mind what the core focus of the Pokemon series is. These are Pokemon that you could find in your backyard, Pokemon where you can go anywhere and just see like roaming wild animals. The creator of Pokemon wanted the series to be a collection of animals you could capture in your backyard. That's why the 3 starter Pokemon are a frog, a salamander, and a Squirtle turtle. Oh my god, I can't even say the word squirrel turtle without saying Squirtle. I mean, just look at it. They kind of cooked. So it makes sense that the first Pokemon that you're gonna find in each generation are bird, another generic bird, a butterfly, an evil monstrosity of doom.
Weedle is a tricky one because yes, we do have Caterpie, but is it really necessary for us to have a second bug Pokemon this early on? I don't want to completely rule it out just yet, so we're just gonna put the Weedle line as our first Pokemon up for contention. Pidgey and Rattata are both of your Route 1 Pokemon, but since they also introduce you to the core concept of the game, obviously they have to stay. Pidgeotto is also caught by Ash in the anime. Rattata is pretty much the go-to Pokemon of every single Team Rocket member, plus your rival Blue has both of these Pokemon in-game no matter what starter you pick, so we can't really get rid of any of those either. Spearow, I don't know. I want to go ahead and cross him off the list, but I'm going to put him in contention as well, because while it's not at the same level of fame as Jigglypuff and Meowth in the anime, the flock of Spearow is the first major story beat in the show. It's the catalyst for the bond that Pikachu and Ash hold so dearly to each other. If it wasn't for that, ooh, look, another second generic normal flying type. Get that shit out of here.
Sandshrew and Sandslash are the first ground type Pokemon that we're going to be introduced to in this generation, and these little guys are going to help us knock out an entire plethora of Pokemon because these are version exclusives.
Since the very first Pokemon games, there's been a handful of Pokemon that are exclusive to each of their respective games. That way you can trade them between your friends and you gotta catch them all, right? Sandshrew and Sandslash are only available in Pokemon Green and Blue, while its counterpart Ekans and Arbok are only available in Pokemon Red. And taking a look at this list here,
there are a lot of Pokemon that we need to cross out.
Vulpix is only available in Pokemon Green, but let's also not forget that this little guy brought pride and joy in the anime. Surprisingly, Pinsir also has to go because it's only available in Pokemon Green and Blue, with Scyther being its counterpart in Pokemon Red, which means that I am 1 for 3 in being wrong in my predictions. So here is the list of every single version exclusive that we have, which means just off of this alone, we can go ahead and knock out 18 more Pokemon right off the bat. And
holy shit, we've already knocked out 67 Pokemon off of the list.
once we get to Pewter City, we finally get to meet our good friend Brock. And Brock, just like in the anime, has a Geodude and an Onix. The Geodude is somewhat special because Geodude evolves via a trade evolution. So Machoke, Haunter, Kadabra, all of these show off a core mechanic of the game. So there goes 9 more right there since we already crossed off Ghastly, plus an added Rock Snake for good measure. Aerodactyl can also be found in Pewter City in the museum after you get cut. And I could make the argument that because you have 2 fossil Pokemon already, that having a 3rd singular fossil Pokemon encourages exploration.
And if you disagree with me, then Lance also has an Aerodactyl, which once we get to the gym leaders, we are gonna be knocking out a motherload.
Heading up to Mount Moon, we get to stop inside the Pokemon Center where we get to purchase our first Pokemon, a Magikarp and a Gyarados. Now, if we ignore the fact that Magikarp is the only Pokemon that can be caught with an old rod, that James had a Magikarp in the anime, that Team Rocket's underwater vessel is shaped like a Magikarp, that Lance and Blue both have Gyarados in their teams during the Elite Four, Yeah, I mean, this Pokemon's pretty useless. Nidoran, male and female. Believe it or not, it's gonna be another one of those Pokemon that's gonna absolutely annihilate another half of the list. While they are the only Pokemon that show a specific gender difference in the first game, you know, before gender existed in the Pokemon universe, they're also the first Pokemon that we encounter, besides Pikachu, that only evolve via an evolutionary stone. So taking into consideration all of the other Pokemon that evolve via a stone, that knocks out 17 more, and that's not including some of the version-exclusive Pokemon we knocked out prior, and also doesn't take into consideration our favorite boy, Eevee. Eevee is a little bit of a special case because Eevee technically isn't necessary in the game whatsoever. There's no prominent trainer in the game that has an Eevee or any of the evolutions, but it's a gift Pokemon available in Celadon Tower, which means you can go the entirety of the game without ever encountering one if you didn't check Phil's PC, which is wildly odd for the secondary mascot of the series. But if we're gonna go ahead and cross them off anyways, this means we already have surpassed 100 Pokemon that are crucial to the original first generation of Pokemon.
And I just want to take a moment to say, if you compare this to any other piece of media, the fact that we can already knock out 100 recognizable characters this quickly, I just beat Elden Ring like a month ago, and I can't even name 10 characters from that game. So 100?
Moving right along, we've got Zubat and Golbat, and I feel like they're synonymous enough as the Resident Cave Pokemon that it's hard to ignore their importance in the game. But even if that wasn't the case, it's essentially the backup to Rattata that Team Rocket uses, and Agatha in the Elite Four also uses a Golbat, so this egregious echolocator has got to stay. Paris and Parasect, I'm gonna go out on a limb and go ahead and put them into contention. They're not featured prominently in the anime. Erica doesn't have one on her team. In fact, not a single trainer inside of the Celadon gym has a Paris or Parasect. And while this is the first grass-type Pokemon you have the chance to encounter in both games, there are plenty of grass types in this game that you can surely find that work tremendously better than Paris and Parasect.
Also, it's really strange to me that the first grass-type Pokemon that you find is like in the middle of a cave. Like, does anybody else find that weird?
Once we leave Mount Moon, we can finally make it to Cerulean City, and goodness gracious, Misty is basically smuggling an aquarium every time she travels with Brock and Ash. We already talked about Psyduck, we already crossed off the star because you know it evolves via a water stone, but she's also smuggling a Goldeen and a Horsey, which means the only water types remaining that she doesn't have are Seal and Dugong, which is one of the very few ice types in the region that is also owned by Lorelei, Slowpoke and Slowbro, which Lorelei also happens to have, Lapras, which is a gift Pokemon that you get inside of Silph which is also owned by Ash in the anime, and you guessed it, Lorelei also happens to have. We also have Tentacool, which is the equivalent of Zubat to the ocean, which, by the way, has a 100% encounter rate. Krabby and Kingler, if you don't remember, Ash had one in the anime because it had to be returned back to Professor Oak when he reached his 6 Pokemon maximum, and Shelter and Cloyster, which we already crossed off the list because they evolved via a water stone, which Lorelei also happens to have!
And with that being said, we have officially knocked out every single water-type Pokemon in the first generation. I initially thought that Krabby could have been included, which I did have as a backup in case none of my other ones panned out. Now, if Krabby wasn't owned by Ash in the anime, well, looks like we gotta give him the whole Who am I kidding? I can never kick this little guy. I have much better things in store for you. So then we head down to Vermilion City, and I completely forgot that if you caught a Spearow earlier in the game, then you can trade this for a Farfetch'd, which is the only place in the game where you can get this little fuck.
I completely forgot about in-game trades whenever I was doing this list, which means Farfetch'd, the second Pokemon I hypothesized was going to be the most useless, has an in-game mechanic that it's tied to, therefore cannot be considered useless. Which means what else can we add to this list? Ponyta and Rapidash can be traded for a Seal. Lickitung, everyone's favorite in Gen 1, because the only way that you can get it is by trading a Slowbro on Route 18, which, I mean, to be fair, we were going to keep him anyways because Jesse had a Lickitung in the anime. Mr. Mime can also be traded for an Abra on Route 2, which at the same time, we were also not going to get rid of because this stud is porking Ash's mom back in Pallet Town, and I feel like if we were to get rid of him, he would come through the Game Boy and try to attack me. And Jinx, which I completely forgot about back in Cerulean City, is only available by trading a Poliwhirl. And is also...
I'm also really sad to say that of all of my predictions, Tangela also has to go too. You can trade a Venonat for a Tangela in the Pokemon Lab on Cinnabar Island. But it doesn't really matter anyways because I just completely forgot that Erica, the 4th gym leader, has a Tangela on her team. So I am 3 for 3 for lost predictions so far, but I promise once I get to Gen 2, I think I've got it pretty figured out. Wait a second, I lost my train of thought. Where are we?
For Voltorb, I'm gonna go ahead and put a hard no, because aside from Raichu, Lieutenant Surge also has a Voltorb, but Magnemite I'm gonna go ahead and put in contention since there's only one trainer inside of Vermilion Gym that uses one. We already crossed out Electabuzz when we talked about version exclusives, so this leaves us with very few electric-type Pokemon, so we're gonna have to revisit this when we've knocked out just a couple more because we're already at— Jesus Christ, that was fast.
Now let's say you can't beat Lieutenant Surge because you're a weak little baby man, you can't take on an electric type Pokemon. Well, fuck you. Go to Diglett Cave and get a Diglett, I guess. I think Diglett Cave is an awesome idea. A whole entire cave dedicated to one Pokemon that's burrowing from one town to another, plus that Pokemon being a key essential counter to the electric type gym. That's just smart game design. The alternative to this would be to backtrack through this cave all the way to Mount Moon to go get a Geodude in there and go back to Lieutenant Surge and beat him. But at that point, you still gotta go through the cave that gives you a ground type Pokemon that's gonna help you defeat Lieutenant Surge. Also, Giovanni has a Dugtrio, and if you watch the original Pokemon anime at any point in time, then you are gonna have this as a vocal stem for the rest of your life.
Drowsy can be found next to Vermilion City, and I'm also going to put this into contention as well. Sabrina doesn't have a Drowsy or a Hypno on her team, none of the Elite Four members or your rival will ever have one, and it's not used as any tradable Pokemon, so for right now, we're just going to need to push this little Tapir off to the side. Going north of Vermilion, I think it's pretty safe to say that we can also knock out Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan since one, they're gift Pokemon that you can receive next to the true Saffron City Gym, but they're also held by Bruno in the Elite Four, so they still have necessity regardless. If we head out to the east, we can encounter Venonat and Venomoth on the routes leading from Lavender Town to Fuchsia City, and they're gonna have to stay. Sabrina has a Venomoth on her team despite the fact that it's not a psychic type, and as far as the anime goes, Tracy, yep, you remember Tracy, also has a Venonat in the anime, which I'm not sure if anybody knew this, but Venonat is 3 foot 3 inches tall. Like, look at this little absolute unit of a man. How can I kick him out of the Pokedex?
So I was gonna talk about how if you go up north, then you can get a Kangaskhan from the Rock Tunnel, but I was actually confusing that with Pokemon Gold and Silver. But it looks like I did make a mistake because Kangaskhan, alongside Tauros and Rhydon, they are all tradable Pokemon in the Japanese blue version, exclusive to only Japan.
Even if we disregard that, the first time you encounter Giovanni, he does have a Kangaskhan and a Rhyhorn, but Rhydon is also considered the first Pokemon ever designed by Ken Sugimori for the Pokemon series, so I just don't feel comfortable nixing the first Pokemon ever designed. That just doesn't seem right to me. As far as Tauros goes, the Pokemon anime had a banned episode in Japan due to its over-excessive use of firearms pointed at Ash and company. 4 kids banned this episode from ever being shown in the US, but that leaves a giant plot hole because Ash later on in the series just shows up with 30 Tauros being held by Professor Oak. He still has the relevancy in the anime as a reoccurring character, so we have to include that based off of my rules.
Speaking of banned episodes, the Porygon episode was also banned in the United States. Porygon is interesting because not a single character in the game has a Porygon, and Porygon was also banned in the United States due to a series of flashing lights in Japan that ended up hospitalizing children when watching the anime upon its release. So imagine this scene, but it's playing 10 times as fast because I don't want to give you an epileptic seizure here. So there's a whole entire generation of people who saw Porygon in Pokemon Stadium or Pokemon Snap for the first time and thought, who the fuck is this? However, the way to obtain Porygon in the original games is by purchasing him as a top prize in the game corner. And since this is the only place in the game where you can technically find a Porygon, he's tied to an in-game mechanic and therefore he stays. Now there's only 4 Pokemon left that I haven't talked about that fits none of the requirements that I've talked about before. And those Pokemon are the Doduo-line, Chansey, and Ditto.
Never mind the fact that Chansey is literally the Nurse Joy Pokemon that's in every single Pokemon Center across every single region across the globe. Chansey is the most elusive Pokemon in the game, with only a 4% chance of appearing in the Safari Zone and having the lowest base catch rate of any Pokemon in the Safari Zone as well, so Chansey can easily be marked off this list. Ditto, I kinda deliberated a little bit because if I'm staying objective, there's not really anything that gives him an exact purpose. Much like Porygon, there isn't a single Pokemon trainer in the game that uses Ditto, you can't claim him as a post-game Pokemon because while we mostly know of him being in Cerulean Cave, he's also available on 4 separate routes in-game. Ditto is featured in the anime, and while not being a recurring character, I'd argue is one of the most well-recognized episodes in the first generation, with Duplica's Ditto trying to transform without having this derpy little face. He's not available as a gift, he's not available in any type of trade, he's not version exclusive, he isn't positioned as some sort of counter or elusive Pokemon in its respective area,
But damn it! I would make the argument that Ditto is one of the most unique Pokemon in Generation 1. It can transform into any Pokemon, with the only other available to do that being Mew, and this also alludes to the long-running theory that Ditto is taking genetics from Mew, because Mew is the one that created every single Pokemon in the universe due to its DNA, or something like that. I'm kind of ad-libbing at this point. Breeding wasn't available in Gen 1, so there's no real purpose in catching one of those to utilize the in-game mechanics. It's just a little pink blob. But ultimately, I think that little pink blob has got to stay off of uniqueness alone.
I would also expend the same argument to Eevee if it wasn't a gift Pokemon. Here you've got a Pokemon that can transform into 3 different species via evolutionary stones. That alone makes Eevee unique enough to be worthy of a conversation of memorability. So to have a Pokemon that can transform into every Pokemon, Ditto has to stay.
Which leaves us with Doduo and Dodrio, another couple Pokemon that don't have any use by any notable trainers in the game. In fact, only 4 trainers have Doduo or Dodrio on their teams. It's not a gen exclusive, it doesn't lay out any of the requirements that I had before, so that leaves us with 5 families of Pokemon that are left. The Magnemite line, the Doduo line, the Paris line, the Weedle line, and the Drowsy line, which means we have to narrow this down from 11 Pokemon.
Now, Magnemite is the first Pokemon introduced to be a Steel type. However, the first generation Magnemite is not a Steel type, so we can't really use that as leverage. However, I do feel like Magnemite is important enough to stay due to the sheer fact alone that without Magnemite, you would have a very barren power plant. If you don't have Pokemon Red version, you're not gonna encounter Electabuzz. So to have a full location with a legendary Pokemon where all you can encounter is a Voltorb and a Pikachu, that doesn't really sit right with me, so I feel it makes sense to include Magnemite and Magneton as a third electric evolutionary line. And with your mascot character being an electric type and only having 5 other electric Pokemon outside of its evolutionary line, I think adding another electric type Pokemon here is the right call.
Now, before I get to what the most useless Pokemon is, I want to take a second to think of what the 3 most important Pokemon are in each generation. Take a wild guess what the most important one is this generation. I mean, it's Pikachu. Pikachu hasn't been flying above the streets of New York for 30 years for us to not include him as the most important Pokemon of all time. While Eevee has joined him in recent years, Eevee didn't really gain that prevalent of popularity and branding until Generation 3. With the release of Pokemon Coliseum and XD Gale of Darkness, it saw a little bit of a surge, but then it saw another major surge when Sylveon was introduced as a brand new type in Generation 6. So while arguably Eevee is the second most important Pokemon as of right now, back then, you could take Eevee out of the Pokedex and not many people would be able to recognize it. As much as I hate this red bastard too, Charizard has to stay. He's arguably the most beloved Pokemon in history. Game Freak can't go 5 fucking minutes without cramming this bastard into every single piece of media that it has. And just the fact that I'm working on collecting every single Pokemon card and he's the last one that I need for Generation 1, if Pikachu is the face of Pokemon, then Charizard is probably the face of the gamer behind it. God, I hate myself for saying that. And then of course, to round it out, I think we gotta put Mewtwo in there. I mean, most people's first experience with Mewtwo was the Pokemon movie. Plus, he's got the added benefit of being the secret optional boss at the end. He's been in so much of the branding for everything in Pokemon since Generation 1. Mewtwo is the legendary Pokemon, and it makes sense why they keep bringing him back throughout every generation to try to show off some new mechanic or feature. And it's gonna be a little bit of favoritism here, but I do gotta give a special mention to Growlithe. Taking a look at all of the mechanics we've discussed, Growlithe knocks off nearly every single one on the list.
You need a version exclusive Pokemon? Growlithe fits the bill. How do evolutionary stones work? Growlithe fits the bill. Where is Growlithe located in the game? Why, right next to the grass gym leader. Does he have relevancy in the anime? Well, yes he does, because Gary uses an Arcanine, which I'd argue is his ace, and Officer Jenny is always seen with a Growlithe. It's a tradable Pokemon Pokemon in Pokemon Blue. It's a core part of Blaine's team and Champion Blue's team. It has one of the highest base stats of any non-legendary Pokemon in the game.
I guess what I'm trying to say is 5-year-old me knew ball when he picked Growlithe to be his favorite. Now, I deliberated over these last 4 Pokemon for a very good while, and I think the first one that I've got to cross off the list is Weedle.
While Weedle isn't a version exclusive, each bug is heavily skewed towards a different game. Weedle has around a 15 to 20% chance in all of its encounters in Pokemon Red, while Caterpie has no chance of appearing at all. However, in Viridian Forest, Weedle and Kakuna have a combined 85% chance of appearing in Pokemon Red, while Caterpie and Metapod have a combined 10% chance to appear. Now, if this were later in the game, I wouldn't consider this a big deal, but this is the first dungeon and the first instance of varying environments, encouraging exploration and being the first instance of version-exclusive differences. Because Weedle does have an in-game mechanic that expands the world of Pokemon and teaches you in-game,
Weedle isn't entirely useless. Now, as far as these 3 go, I'm not gonna cross any of them off the list just yet, because I wanna be specific about what each one does offer to the game.
One thing that all of these Pokemon have in common is they all show off some sort of status condition. Paris is going to be one of the first Pokemon that you encounter in the game that uses Stun Spore, causing you to be paralyzed. Drowsy and Hypno are the iconic characters that are going to make you fall asleep. And Doduo has Tri-Attack, which leaves you with a 20% chance of being paralyzed, frozen, or burned. However, I'm lying. Tri-Attack didn't have those abilities until the next generation. As far as trainers go, Doduo is used by 4 trainers in the game. Drowsy and Hypno are used by 4 trainers in the Fuchsia City Gym alone, which we're just gonna gloss over the fact that the most common Pokemon in a poison-type gym is a psychic-type elephant. And many of the trainers that are using these 2 are Team Rocket members, meaning it's typically being associated with an evil Pokemon. However, Paris nor Parasect are used by a single trainer in the entire game. So then I started looking into the location of all these Pokemon. Drowsy straight up has no reason to be where it's at. It's next to Vermilion Gym, which gives it no type advantages or in-game mechanics. You can make the argument that because it has Hypnosis, and this is about time where you're gonna have to start using Great Balls to catch Pokemon and using status conditions to weaken the Pokemon to catch them, but I'm still really iffy on that. Doduo is thankfully next to Celadon City, where you can help take down the Grass-type Pokemon. It also has the advantage of being right in the same place where you find the HM Fly,
which is kind of ironic for a flightless bird to be the determining factor there.
Paris, again, is the first Grass-type Pokemon you encounter in both games. However, it also first appears in Mount Moon, which makes sense given the fact that it's a spore-riddled Pokemon. But it has a relatively low encounter rate, and it's possible to go through Mount Moon and never encounter a Paris, which, I mean, you could argue the same about Zubat, but I mean... No. And if we take a look at typing, it doesn't really help much either. Doduo is a normal flying type, which we have 8 total typings and 19 total flying types. Paris and Parasect make for 12 different bug types, which, I'll be honest, is a lot less than I thought there was gonna be. And Drowsy and Hypno give us a total of 14 psychic types, 12 if you exclude Mewtwo and Mew, since they're only available in the post-game.
So at this point, if we're looking at this objectively, I think we genuinely have a 6-way tie. But that doesn't sit right with me. Taking a look at the anime, none of them have any sort of relevancy as reoccurring characters. But do you remember when earlier I said that I wasn't gonna talk about the spin-off games unless I felt like I absolutely have to? Well, I think that's gonna be the answer to our problem.
Alright, I didn't want to do this, but let's take a look at Pokemon Snap, jump into the first level, and just look at the first 10 seconds. Yep. Doduo was the Pokemon Company's first jump scare. Also, we're just gonna ignore the fact that in Pokemon Snap, the first Pokemon you're introduced to is a normal flying type, and then the second Pokemon you're introduced to is yet another normal flying type.
That might be a topic of discussion when we start talking about future generations.
And if we also go over to Pokemon Stadium and go over to the Kids Corner, there's a small little mini game called Snore War, where the purpose of the game is to use Drowsy and press a metronome in time to try to get the other Pokemon to fall asleep as quickly as possible.
And I really didn't want to rely on the spin-offs, but there's a really good argument to be said that the core series games were developed alongside of those spin-offs. Pokemon Red and Blue came out on September 28th, 1998, with Pokemon Stadium and Pokemon Snap being released just a year later. So these Pokemon games were at least in the planning stages before they got to the development, and I would argue that the overall popularity of all of this Pokemon media coming to audiences at the exact same time could be enough of a definitive case to push these Pokemon into more popularity. So, using as much of the objective knowledge that I can, the most useless Pokemon in Generation 1 has to go to Paris. And I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I'm not surprised that I found out that it was Paris. I mean, when I'm thinking of Gen 1 Pokemon, that's one of the Pokemon that I feel like I forget even exists in the first place. But I mean, what do you think? Because I want to turn this into a conversation. I have to go over 8 more generations of Pokemon and a 10th generation that's coming along the way. So if you're interested, there's a link to the Discord down below. I have 9 more generations to go over, like I said, so I'd really want to turn this into an active conversation. And man, I love Growlithe.